So welcome everybody to this panel on finance and social responsibility. Let me start by giving a little bit of background. When Laura asked me to put this panel together, I was actually very excited. I didn't quite realize how hard this would be to actually pull off. And what I soon realized when I started putting the panel together was that in this research area, there were lots and lots of papers. I actually was quite surprised how much academic research there was on this subject, but that almost all of the papers were taking the underlying assumptions as given. And that troubled me because obviously, that's something you need to worry about. But more importantly, certainly in my career, it's questioning well-established underlying assumptions that's led, at least in my life, to path-breaking research. And I think that's generally true. And it worried me that there was not a lot of questioning of the underlying assumptions. That, together with the fact that my own research in this area, as many of you are probably aware, I have this paper which basically calibrates the capital asset pricing model and asks the question, would a diversification strategy work given current parameters? And what astonished me in writing this paper is how much research there has been on this question of diversification, how long the research agenda has been going on, and yet it seemed to me that nobody had actually calibrated the standard model in finance. So again, I was worried that people were not taking underlying assumptions as given without really questioning them. And so I decided what I wanted the panel to do was to look at the underlying assumptions, and more in particular, underlying assumptions that we as financial economists are not necessarily familiar with. And so with that in mind, I set the goal to bring together panelists would have expertise that are generally outside of most of us know in financial economics. And so that's what I hope I've done. I've given each panelist a question, and I'll talk, and what I think I'm going to do is introduce the panelists and also tell you the question I had for them. But I also told the panelists that in no way are they should feel restricted to just talk about that question. So with that in mind, let me start with Alex. Alex is the one panelist that I'm sure everybody's familiar with because he's a pretty successful financial economist. But let me just say to you that the reason I asked Alex to talk on this panel is he's got a very interesting new book called Grow the Pie: How Great Companies Deliver Both Purpose and Profit, which I thought was very relevant to this question, where he, I think, in this book, questions one of the more important underlying assumptions. And so let's start with Alex. Alex, as you know, the question I pose to you is the following: is the most effective way to affect social change through corporation and or financial markets? So that's the prompt question, but you can take it away.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Jonathan. It's great to be here and to have this invitation. I know that everybody, when they are noticed to talk, they say thank you, but this is far from a perfunctory comment. What I'm really excited about in this panel is the idea of questioning the taken for granted assumptions. And to do this, normally you start a talk by quoting some great academic research. Let me instead start with a quote from Alice in Wonderland. So the Queen of Hearts, she made some tarts all on a summer's day. The Knave of Hearts, he stole those tarts and took them clean away. And so what happened? Well, the Knave of Hearts, he was up in a trial. And in the trial, what we had was the king says, let the jury consider their verdict for about the 20th time that day. But then the Queen of Hearts says, no, 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 sentence first, verdict afterwards. And I think this is the approach that many people take for these ESG issues, right? We sort of know what position we would like to take, and then we will reverse engineer the verdict, which will get us the justification for that sentence. So really trying to peel apart these assumptions, actually to start with the evidence rather than starting with the sentence, is what's hopefully we're going to achieve through this panel. So the question that Jonathan asked me to discuss is, well, should it be companies or investors who enact social change? But let me even just question the question. Perhaps it should be neither. Do we even need social change to begin with? And you might think, well, that's a heretical question, right? In 2022, given all of the problems in the world, clearly we do need social change. But let me even question this. So what would it look like to have a world in which there was no social change? Well, often people say it looks like the world espoused by Milton Friedman. So what he wrote in 1970 is the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. And how do we do that? Well, he goes on to say it involves focusing totally on making money and forgetting about any concern for employees, customers, or society. But Friedman never said that. That wasn't Friedman. What I've done is taken a Forbes article which quotes Friedman and claims this is what Friedman says. But if you read the entire article, he never comes close to saying anything like that. Yet anybody who thinks about the Friedman world, they will argue that he advocates pursuing profit at the expense of everything else. So what did Friedman actually say? He said the following: it may well be in the long run interest of a corporation, that is a major employer, to devote resources to providing amenities or to improving its government. Why? Well, that's actually good for profits in the long term. So why he said it's fine to just focus on profits is that will encourage a company to enact social change. But they can't pollute the environment too much, otherwise its brand will be hurt. It can't mistreat its workers or they'll leave, and it has to produce great products because customers will stop buying. Now, any argument that anybody making this argument, you've got the immediate response, well, what about externalities? Right, that assumes that everything you do to help society will ultimately affect profits, but there are externalities. But if there are externalities, maybe the people who should deal with these externalities are not companies and not investors, but they are governments. And this is what Friedman stresses. He says that you need to conform to the basic rules of society and to stay within the rules of the game. And it's the government who sets the rules of the game, and it shouldn't be companies or investors. And what's the argument for that? Is that the government is hopefully representative and democratic, where every person has one vote, whereas we leave it to, say, investors, maybe they only represent the elites. So maybe they might think about decarbonisation and not be concerned that that's going to lead to a massive loss of jobs in the Rust Belt. Why? Because it's really wealthy people who own stock, and therefore they'll be going to call the shots, whereas if it's a government, there everybody has one vote. So if we want to move away from Friedman and argue that there is a role in somebody other than the government to enact social change, we need to highlight where Friedman fails. And so for the 50th anniversary of the Friedman article, Luigi Zagales compiled a set of articles on the 50th anniversary. And I wrote something called What Stakeholder Capitalism Can Learn from Milton Friedman on pro-market. And so what I highlighted is we should see Friedman not as a doctrine, but as a theorem, right? Just like Modigliani and Miller, we don't believe that capital structure is irrelevant, but only if there are imperfections does it become relevant. And that's the same with Friedman. So only if one of three assumptions are violated do we want to move away from just profit maximization and have a social objective. So what are those assumptions? Well, one assumption he made is that government intervention is effective. But there might be factors that are difficult to regulate. Right? We can have things like a sugar tax and maybe a carbon tax, you can measure that. But can you measure a company's corporate culture? Can you measure whether there's a psychologically safe place to work? That's not something that you can ever measure or prosecute. So maybe that's something that companies or investors might want to step into and address. But this is a really important starting point, because only if it is something that you don't think the government is dealing with, should this be something that companies are doing themselves. The second implicit assumption in Friedman is he assumed that serving society is zero-sum. So the only thing he considers is charitable donations, where if I was to give $1 to Greenpeace, well, it's worth $1 to them. And if that's the case, well, then a company shouldn't give to charity. It's better off giving that money to its shareholders, and shareholders support charitable causes. But there are some actions in which companies do have a comparative advantage. Maybe it's better for a company to invest that $1 in reducing its plastic packaging, and that would actually have a much greater effect on the environment than if it's to donate that $1 to Greenpeace. But again, Friedman is useful because only if you have a comparative advantage, if you're creating more than what you invest in society, should you do that. The final thing, which is more hidden, but what I really tried to emphasize in the book, is this is the idea that it's actually quite difficult to maximize shareholder value instrumentally. So what the whole idea of NPV, which finance professors like me have taught for 50 years and so, is that what we try to do when thinking of an investment is we'll try to forecast the future benefits from that investment. So those are cash flows. So let's say we're thinking about building a factory. We can estimate how many widgets the factory will produce and how much you can sell them for. Now, we know that there's uncertainty, right? We know that there's risk, but we can deal with that. We can have some sensitivity analyses with different prices for the widgets, different volumes, different costs of capital. However, there are some investments where it's really difficult even to have a starting point. So let's say you're a company, you choose to give more parental leave to your employees. Maybe you have some sense that employees are going to be more motivated and more productive, but it's hard even to have a midpoint to start with, and therefore it's really difficult to justify that with a net present value calculation. So this is the idea that it's difficult to maximize shareholder value instrumentally, but instead, if you're going to take an intrinsic approach, let's create value for society because it's the right thing to do, then ultimately that might end up benefiting you in the long run in terms of your profits. It's a bit like us as, let's say, academics, let's say for those of us in the audience who are finance professors, if our goal is to maximize whatever it is that we're trying to maximize, let's say impact on the profession, if we would do this with an instrumental way, maybe we would only focus on our own papers. We would never comment on other people's papers or engage in citizenship. However, if we're going to take this more intrinsic approach and try and be a good citizen, maybe that in the long term might benefit us unexpectedly and lead to us being more successful. So there might be a reason for having social goals, and that could actually lead you to becoming more successful in the long term. So with that framework in mind, let me spend my final 5 minutes as to who should it be who's enacting the social change. So what I try and stress in the book, Grow the Pie, and by the way, Christina did a great review of the book in the Notre Dame Law Review, which really goes beyond the book in many ways and highlights the implications for legal scholars, is I highlight that if a company wants to do social actions, it has to be principled. So why is that important? Right, people are arguing we need to move beyond net present value, but as a manager, you can't just abandon net present value because then you have no criterion to guide you to make decisions. It becomes a free-for-all and there's no accountability. So what I highlighted is these two principles. One of them is comparative advantage. So that goes back to one of the ideas I mentioned earlier. You should only do something to serve society if your investment has a multiplicative effect, if $1 of investment creates much more than $1 of social value, so charitable donations don't satisfy that. So that's the impact that a company has on society. But materiality is in the other direction. That is the effect that a stakeholder has on you. For example, we know that climate change is the order of the day, and I know there's a lot of pressure for every company to be top of the tree in climate change. Now, that might matter for some industries, like energy, but maybe in the tech industry, maybe the most material issues are things such as cybersecurity, misinformation, and so on. So maybe you don't want to focus on those particular issues. So the punchline here is that when you have a company deciding social change, the benefits is that the company can think which are the issues for that company that are most material to it, where if they are to outperform on those social dimensions, it will improve the long-term business. And number two, those are the issues that it has unique expertise in solving. So it means that the company won't try to be all things to all people. It won't try to hit all 17 sustainable development goals, but to think about the couple of issues that it can really move the needle. Well, what's the problem with just leaving it to companies? Is that, well, actually a manager might not pursue those principles, is that she might have incentives to pursue other objectives because of her own social benefits. So this is the idea of agency problems, which is a cornerstone of corporate finance, is that, well, maybe you'll do something because it's a social cause that you happen to like, Maybe if you're to be seen as a social champion, then you're going to be able to write books, you're going to be seen as a pariah and so on. Or it could be that you could donate to charity and you can benefit from those charitable donations. So this recent paper finds that if you're donating to a charity which is affiliated with the remuneration committee, then you get paid more, you're less likely to be fined for poor performance. So we can't entirely leave it to companies, because even though in theory companies can tailor their social objectives to what best fits their company, it might be that they will just pursue what the CEO wants. So the alternative is instead to leave it to investors. And so why might that be beneficial? Well, because investors can then themselves try to hold the company to account, to think about, well, what are the issues that are going to be important for that company? And also it might be that investors themselves, their objective is not even long-term shareholder value. It might be that they're quite happy with a company investing in an immaterial issue, because their objective is not just long-term shareholder value, but the social issue in and of themselves. And so this is something that Oliver Hart and Luigi Gonzalez, among others, have highlighted, that we need to put this decision in investors' hands. This whole idea of stakeholder capitalism should not be seen as anti-shareholder capitalism. But there's also problems with leaving it to investors. And so what I'm doing here is I'm quoting from Larry Fink's shareholders' letter at the start of last year, saying things like, the more your company can show its purpose, the better it will be for shareholders. Now, I've spoken to some executive directors who look at that and say that's basically patronizing. Like, we know as a company, we need to treat our customers, employees, and communities well. Why do you as an investor think you have unique insight on that? You are further from the business than I am. Also, he says, we're asking companies to disclose plans for how to get to a net zero economy. But I, as a director or as an executive, I know that net zero is important. I know that climate change is an issue. Don't micromanage me. And don't tell me who to hire either. So one of the challenges with leaving it to investors is that you can have micromanagement. And what is the incentive that investors have to micromanage? Is that investors themselves might not have long-term shareholder value or even long-term social value as their objective. So there could be quite a lot of reputational benefits from saying, well, I'm an investor who is always going to be voting against management or voting for these ESG proposals. That might be a good way to gather assets. It might be that you're a gadfly investor who wants to pursue some social cause because it's your particular thing. And so what this ends with, and this is going to be where I land, is that if investors are going to choose to engage, they should choose to engage on only the issues where they might have unique expertise in addressing. So there's just one sort of broad taxonomy. You can have generalized engagement. And so those are issues that you can apply to basically every company. So it might be in every company, let's push for more long-term pay, let's push for, let's say, CEO chairman separation. And that's something that perhaps index funds are better at because they're not deep into any particular company. Or you could have specialized engagement where you're going to take one particular company and look at, well, how can we improve that particular company's ESG issues in a tailored way? And that's something active funds might be better at. So just to answer the exam question that Jonathan asked, who should it be who enacts social change? It has to be something where all parties play a role. So the government should start with things that it can measure, and that's useful because the government, that is a democratic process. But where the government fails, because you can't regulate something, then we should have both companies and investors, but it can't be just one or the other, because there are agency problems, which might mean that CEOs do something to maximize their own private benefits, or investors do something to maximize asset gathering. So what I've hoped I've done in these 15 minutes to provide a set of principles for where you should be pursuing social goals and where you should actually leave it to somebody else. Thanks once again, Jonathan, for the opportunity.
Alex, thank you very much. I always wonder, the point you made when outsiders turn around and say, oh, yes, this is good for the corporation and it's good for society. They're basically saying, if that's true, that the people running the corporation don't know what they're doing because it's good for the corporation and they're not doing it. They're making a mistake. So, I just wonder when they make these statements. In any way, that was very good, Alex. I meant to say this at the beginning, I forgot to say, each panelist is going to have 15 minutes, and then we're going to open the panel to general discussion. I'm not going to be the person selecting questions. I'm going to try to do this as if we were in the same room where anybody can ask questions, and we'll just see what happens. Okay, so our next panelist is Steve Koonin, who's Professor of Information or Operations and Management Sciences at NYU and Director of NYU's Center for Urban Science and Progress. Most people who are familiar with Steve would probably be familiar because of his best-selling book, Unsettled. I will say this, as a book writer myself, I'm always in awe of somebody who actually writes a book where people choose to read and it becomes a bestseller. It's quite another thing if you write a textbook and people are forced to read it, but when you actually write a book and people choose to read it, I think is an impressive accomplishment. Anyway, but before Steve wrote the book, he was a professor of physics at Caltech. He was then provost of Caltech. After leaving, he left Caltech, though, to become chief scientist at BP, and then decided to go into public service. And so in 2009, he was appointed Undersecretary for Science by Barack Obama. He left government in 2012 to become the founding director of NYU Center for Urban Science and Progress. Okay, Steve, as you know, the question I posed to you is, what, you know, in finance, there's this tremendous push for businesses to identify the exposure to climate change, and this idea that there's a systemic climate risk that we need to be worried about. So the question I have for you is, what are the social risks corporations are exposed to, and what does the science actually tell us about that? Okay, floor is yours.
Good, thank you very much, Jonathan. I want to talk about climate science. As Jonathan mentioned, I am at heart a scientist. And certainly climate and energy are front and center among the both societal, corporate, individual concerns today. We know that the global average temperature anomaly has gone up by about 1 degree centigrade since the start of the 20th century. And we'd like to know, how is this changing? Why is it changing, both globally and locally, and also in the recent and more distant past? We'd also like to know how the climate is going to change in the future under natural and growing human influences, and human influences are growing. This is the graph of the carbon dioxide concentration in the Earth's atmosphere since 1960, and you can see it started at roughly 310 and is today upwards of 420, and it keeps on growing, largely because we are burning fossil fuels and emitting carbon dioxide. The UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, says that under plausible trajectories for the rest of the century, we'll see a rise of another 1.6 degrees by the end of this century. And of course, the real question is, how are these changes going to impact ecosystems and societies, and what should we do about this? Well, the people who are making decisions for society profess belief in the science. President Biden, on his first day in office, said it's the policy of my administration to listen to the science. John Kerry, his ambassador for climate matters, said, let there be no doubt in anybody's mind that the science is absolutely certain. I'll leave it to you to parse the rest of that sentence. I can't quite do that myself. And then there are a whole bunch of other characters on the world stage who are talking about existential threat, climate crisis, climate emergency, climate disaster. I put in here a picture of Larry Fink and Mark Carney, pictures that are probably familiar to this audience. Maybe less familiar is Ernie Moniz, who was Secretary of Energy under the second Obama administration, a physicist at MIT and a good friend, Bill Gates, of course. Secretary General of the UN, Guterres, said when the latest UN report was released on climate science in August, code red for humanity. Billions of people are at immediate risk. To tip my hand a little bit, if you search the 3,949 pages of that report, you don't find the words existential threat, climate emergency, climate disaster anywhere in the report. You do find the phrase climate crisis once, and that's used not as a scientific finding, but in fact as a statement of how the media have dumbed down the problem. And then finally, in the US, the Secretary of Defense has declared climate change an existential threat. So this is pretty serious. The science of climate, as opposed to the science that the politicians and decision makers talk about, is contained in a series of assessment reports put out by the UN. The penultimate one in 2014, the most recent one, as I mentioned, in this year, on August 9th, the US government puts out similar reports. These are meant to survey and assess the science and provide advice for non-experts. When you read them, they say important and surprising things. I can guarantee you that almost nobody whose picture appeared on the previous slide has read these reports. Perhaps Bill Gates and Ernie Moniz have, but maybe not. And maybe they haven't even read the summaries for policymakers. I'm often reminded of a phrase from the movie The Princess Bride, where Inigo Montoya says, "You keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means." And when I read the reports and I listen to what people say, it's not what the science says. Let me give you some examples. Heat waves in the US are now no more common in 1900 than they were in 1900, and the warmest temperatures across the US haven't risen in the past 50 years. That's right out of the US government report. Global fire area has gone down by 25% since 2003, and last year was among the most least active years in the record. I give you references there. Greenland's ice sheet isn't shrinking any more rapidly today than it was 80 years ago. And back then, human influences were less than a fifth of what they are today. And I give you the paper there. There are others as well. There's been no detectable human impact on hurricanes over the past century. And the net economic impact of a 6-degree warming, if it happened, will be minimal. As finance folks, you might be particularly interested in that last statement. I'll go into that in a bit more detail, but again, rest assured, it's what the reports say. Statements like these and many others belie the notion that we've already broken the climate and face certain disaster unless we act promptly on an enormous scale. How did the science get turned into the science? Well, it's a big game of telephone. It starts with the observational data and the research literature. It goes into these assessment reports, which are massive documents, onto the summaries for policymakers, which are often imperfect reflections of what's in the actual reports, then onto the media, and then out to the decision makers and the public. There is much opportunity to distort or even corrupt the message along the way. Weather gets confused with climate. They're very different things. Recent trends are highlighted without historical context. There are activist reporters that are trying to persuade rather than inform, and so on. And I wrote the book, which Jonathan mentioned, in order to short circuit this chain and get people to see what's really in the reports. Everything in the book is right out of the reports. I have been likened to John Tyndall, who in the early 16th century England translated the Bible from Latin to English so that many more people could see what was in it. Tyndall was burned at the stake. All right, let me give you a couple of examples. Projections for sea level. Everybody is worried about sea level. Here is from the most recent IPCC report. They are truly extraordinary. I'm going to show you not the global projections, but because I live in Manhattan, I'm very interested in what goes on at the Battery in Manhattan. There has been a tide gauge there accurately measuring the level of the harbor for the last 160 years. Here is the trend on a 30-year time scale in millimeters per year since 1920. And you can see it goes up and down. It averages about 3 millimeters a year, which is a foot a century. And it goes ups and downs. And of course, people, they say, it's high and it's going to keep going up. And in fact, the IPCC models under various assumptions all show the rate of rise going up like that. Of course, with significant error bars, so they've got themselves covered no matter what happens. If I had a bet, my guess is that it continues to go up and down like that, but we shall see. The experts know that we shouldn't place too much faith in these models. Here's Helen Nissan and collaborators, a set of modelers at Columbia, writing in a peer-reviewed journal, the use of these climate models to guide local practical adaptation is unwarranted. Climate models can't represent future conditions with anywhere near the degree of precision or accuracy that we need, and they give a false impression of confidence to users of climate change information. So yes, I understand uncertainty is intrinsic to your business, but this is extraordinarily uncertain, and I would say almost useless. Let me talk about weather extremes. Risk doesn't come so much from a changing climate as from weather extremes. We saw a series of weather events this summer: heat wave in the Northwest, floods in Europe and China, fires, dead fish, climate change fuels extreme weather with no return to normal, said the New York Times, and the climate apocalypse, said the Boston Globe. It's going to get worse. It sure helps to sell papers. But people forget that weather is not climate, and climate plays out over decades. In order to show that to you, let me take you to Egypt, and we're going to go to Rhoda Island, which is an island in the middle of Cairo, and there is a structure there that was built by the Egyptians in the beginning of the 7th century to measure the height of the Nile River. If you go into it, and I was in it a decade or so ago, it's a big chamber with a pillar marked in cubits that lets you measure the height of the Nile. The Egyptians have been doing this since the early 7th century because the Nile was really important to them. Here's what the data look like. This is the annual minimum of the Nile. The Nile drains about 10% of Africa, which is about a third of the continental US. So this is a pretty good measure of the hydroclimate across a good chunk of Africa. And what you see is that the annual values go up and down a lot. One year it was way up at almost 6 meters, and then it goes down to 2 meters, et cetera, et cetera. If you take a running average of 30 years, it still goes up and down. And I can just imagine some medieval Egyptian climate panel saying new normal, as the river dried up over these 100 some odd years. And of course, recommending prayers and sacrifices and whatever. And eventually they just waited a while. It came back up again. We do this today. NASA put out a press release in 2006 talking about Lake Victoria's falling waters. Lake Victoria is what drives this level. And then in 2021, there was a press release about Lake Victoria's rising waters. So a little bit of long-term perspective and humility in predicting local climates is really important. Let me just give you one more example. People forget weather. In New York, in the beginning of September this year, we had a record 1-hour rainfall. There it is. This is the record in Central Park of 1-hour rainfall since 1965. There were a couple of others, but this was the largest. I couldn't find 1-hour rainfalls going back further, but I could find one-day rainfalls. And at least on the one-day scale, here is the 2021 record, but you see that there were 4 of the days in Central Park that were rainier than that one, and not particularly many of them in recent years. So again, people tend to forget weather, and it's really important to have that perspective. Let me turn to the economic impact of warming, which is something that I'm sure you're maybe quite concerned with. If you turn to the US report in 2018, if we don't mitigate emissions, climate change is projected to impose substantial damages on the US economy. Under scenarios with high emissions, annual losses in some cases are estimated to go to hundreds of billions of dollars by the end of the century. Well, if you're not numerate or don't know about economics, hundreds of billions of dollars might sound like a lot of money. And in fact, they give us this table, which is remarkable in the report, not only for its granularity, There are the various sectors down to bridges and shellfish and so on. Annual economic damages in 2090 under a high emissions scenario, and avoided damages if we can mitigate emissions. Look at the precision, 3 significant digits, 155 billion, not 153 and not 158, but 155, okay? If you don't know anything about numbers, like some of the people on the first chart I showed you, okay, it sounds impressive. And of course, the media play it up. Climate change will wall up the US economy, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a graph in the report, the last graph in the last chapter, that shows direct damage to the US economy as a percent of GDP in 2100 as a function of the global temperature change compared to today. And what you see is that it's a few percent for a few degrees. These are Fahrenheit degrees, by the way, because it's a US report. Bjorn Lomborg compiled something more recently, same thing for the globe, couple percent for a couple of degrees. In fact, if you read the UN report, which again, not many people do, they say for most economic sectors, the impact of climate change will be small relative to the impacts of other drivers. And so here's an example. This is the US GDP in constant dollars from today, projected out at 2% nominal growth rate. A 4% climate impact in 2090 gives you the orange line. 10% impact in 2090 gives you the gray line. In other words, you get a few years delay in the growth. I would love to ask some of the numerate people who keep saying climate crisis, is this really the climate crisis? Is this what we're talking about? Maybe you don't believe the economics, you don't believe the report, but then show me what else you've got. Okay, I'm going to skip over tipping points. I'm happy to talk about them in the and let me just try to wrap up. I guess I got just a minute or two. What should we do about all of this? It's a complicated business. Science, values, technology. The world has been focusing on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But in fact, we don't burn fossil fuels for nothing. We burn them for energy to meet current and growing energy demand. Energy demand is highly correlated with economic activity. Most of the world is developing. They're going to need energy. In fact, 40% of today's population, 3 billion people, don't have adequate energy, and fossil fuels are the most convenient and reliable source. In fact, again, a lot of this is really going to happen in the developing world, not in the OECD countries. As you can see, their emissions are growing. Advanced economies are generally reducing their emissions slowly. To even stabilize human influences on the climate, which, as you've seen, changes all on its own as well, we need to go to zero emissions by 2050 or zero by 2075 to hold at 2 degrees. And I would say not that it's unlikely that we're going to do that, but it's a fantasy that the world will do that, given what happened in COP26. So my takeaways, and that'll be the end. Limited observations and understanding mean we don't really understand how the climate's going to respond to human influences. Even as human influences have grown by a factor of 5 in the last 70 years, most severe weather phenomena remain within past variability. The projections of what's going to happen in the future rely on models that are demonstrably unfit for the purpose. Nevertheless, the consensus is that the net GDP impacts are a few percent for a few degrees in 2100. We're unlikely to even stabilize human influences, and adaptation is likely going to be the dominant response, and we're very good at it. The world has prospered since 1900. Population has surged by a factor of 4, and we've seen the greatest improvement in human welfare, even as the globe warmed by a degree. It's crazy to think that another 1.5 degrees is going to derail things. We're going to decarbonize, but we need to do it thoughtfully and gradually. If you talk about systemic threats, precipitous climate action is a far greater threat than climate change. We're seeing that already with the energy crises that are roiling the world. And then we should not forget about other systemic risks that, in my view, are much greater. Cyber, solar storms is something that's ill appreciated by most people, but could easily knock out the electrical grid worldwide. Nuclear EMP, electromagnetic pulse, pandemics, asteroids, I don't have to mention. They've been in the news so much these days. So that's what I've got to say. And I'll look forward to your comments and questions when we get to that part of the presentation.
Steve, I just have a couple of questions for you. I just want to clarify one thing, because economists, when we talk about economic growth, we're almost always talking growth rates, right? But when you were talking about GDP, you were not talking about a rate, you were talking about the total GDP. So we're talking about growth rates. So if you say in 100 years, we're going to be 3%, the effect on GDP is 3%. It's the absolute growth of GDP in 100 years will be 3% lower, which implies a rate, I don't know what that is, but of, you know,
another way to say it,
a year, which is very hard to maintain.
If your rate is 1% a year, let's say, then it's equivalent to 3 years of delay if it's a 3% effect.
Okay, 3 years over 100 years. Okay. Now, the second thing I wanted you to talk about, and maybe you can just briefly talk about, is there is a very big push to require companies to reveal their risk of climate change. And so, you know, in reading your book, what it became clear to me that that's not even a well-posed question, because it's not clear how you would actually measure in any meaningful way any company's risk. I mean, is that correct? And I mean, what is your view of that?
Yeah, let's let me just put this chart up again, which may have gone by you. You know, with that kind of uncertainty in, let's say, what the sea level is going to do, I don't know how you measure that risk. All right. I don't know how I pick among those models. Right. They're all high, but they're so discordant with what we're at right now. You know, it's worse than entrails, I would say.
I mean, one of the things that struck me is if you take the models and you move and you start in 1900 and you ask the models to predict the next 100 years, they are unable to predict the actual reality, right? I mean, that's is that a fair way of saying it?
I mean, they have a hard time predicting significant variations in the historical record, and then they have quite divergent predictions for what's going to happen to just the temperature, which is the easiest thing to try to predict, to just the temperature at the end of the century. I've got some charts here, but I'm not going to take the time to pull them up.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Steve.
Just one sort of quip. You know, I was once talking to Larry Summers a couple of years ago, and I joked to him that climate economics was doubly dismal because you've got all the problems with economics conflated with all the problems in climate modeling.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily agree that economics is the dismal science. But okay, thank you very much, Steve. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure the audience can have lots of questions for you. So, okay, so the idea was Steve would talk about something that most of us are not familiar, which was the actual science behind climate change. And so our next panelist is Sarah Breeden, who's the Executive Director of Financial Stability, Strategy and Risk, and a member of the Financial Policy Committee of the Bank of England. The FPC, the Financial Policy Committee, is United Kingdom's macroprudential authority. It's tasked by Parliament with guarding the financial system against damaging the wider economy. And Sarah is responsible for the Bank of England's work to deliver that objective. She also leads the Bank of England's work on climate change, domestically and internationally, a role she's had since 2016. She's chair of the macro financial work stream of International Central Bank and supervises Network for Greening of the Financial System, NGFS. So with that in mind, obviously central banks are a focus right now. I mean, as a financial economist, I've watched, if you'd asked me 30 years ago what the role of a central bank was, I would have said control inflation, that's it. And so I've watched with some astonishment that central banks have taken on new roles. And so I posed the question to Sarah, does the mandate of a central bank include anything other than controlling inflation? And if so, what defines the mandate of a central bank? If the mandate does include social responsibility, what defines that responsibility, and where are the limits? And I think that that's a pretty important question that we need to think about as academics. So Sarah, take it away.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jonathan. And thanks for the invite. I spoke at this conference a couple of years ago in San Diego. The weather then was much nicer than it is here in London on a miserable Friday evening. But at least my participation on this occasion has led to a much lower carbon footprint. And I wanted to build on those themes in my comments today, rather than talking about central banks and social responsibility generally. I wanted to pick up on climate change in particular, some of the issues that Steve just talked about. There's a growing awareness. Mark Carney's first speech on the topic back in 2015, which attracted questioning headlines, but now it's much more mainstream. The NGFS, the Central Bank and Supervisors Network that Jonathan mentioned, was an organization founded by the Bank of England and 7 others 4 years ago. And it now has over 100 of our peers involved, including all the major central banks as members. Central bankers regularly speak on the topic. My colleague on the FPC, Carolyn Wilkins, is talking tomorrow on climate finance, and this conference has got a much bigger focus on climate than when we were in San Diego just 2 years ago, reflecting the much greater focus that Alex and Steve have talked about as to how climate matters for the macroeconomy and finance, as well as the microeconomics of market failures. It's really been a shift. And what I hope to do in my remarks is to explain how climate change is relevant to the Bank of England's mandate and touch briefly on what we're doing about it. But I also want to start by being really clear about what we're not doing. Addressing climate change is an important issue for society. It's arguably the greatest challenge of our generation. And central banks have got an important role to play in addressing that. But it's really important we stay in our swim lane, focused on our role on the topic and recognizing that we're not the only game in town. At the bank, we've sought to capture that in our objective for our climate work, and that is to play a leading role through our policies and operations in ensuring that the financial system, the macroeconomy and the bank are resilient to the risks from climate change and supportive of the transition to a net zero economy. An objective that I would summarize as dealing with the consequences of climate change, not dealing with its causes. Dealing with causes is, of course, for elected governments. That's because doing so comes with tough choices, and the tools to address that issue lie with governments, not central banks. We don't want to be a backseat driver on climate policy, a climate regulator of last resort, if you like, but we've also been clear that neither can we ignore climate change. The financial and economic consequences of climate change are potentially significant, and the actions of the financial system are crucial in supporting government climate policy. That could be about financing the transition to a net zero economy, or as Steve was just mentioning, it could be about building and ensuring the resilience that is needed to deal with a hotter climate. So I think central banks have got a really important role to play, but it must be grounded in our mandate. So how does climate change matter for us? Different central banks have got different mandates, so there'll be variants on what I say, reflecting individual circumstances. circumstances, but there's a huge amount of commonality. As far as the Bank of England and climate change is concerned, 3 aspects of our policy mandate are relevant, all of which are grounded in statutory responsibilities that we've been given by Parliament: price stability, financial stability, and the safety and soundness of banks and insurers. And in fact, it was dealing with the safety and soundness of insurers that first got us into this whole topic. Lloyd's of London is the insurer for much of the world's extreme weather events, and Carney's first intervention on this topic followed a thorough analysis of what climate change would mean for their safety and soundness. In our work, we identify 2 channels through which changes to the climate matter for central bank and supervisory mandates. First, there's the physical risks. Physical risks damage property, other infrastructure, disrupt business supply chains and food systems, influence productivity, might lead to displacement and conflict. They cover acute events, floods, fires, typhoons, and then those longer term trends. The rise in the sea level that could, absent mitigation, leave many of the globe's largest cities underwater. All of that has economic and financial consequences, reducing asset values, affecting corporate profitability, damaging public finances, and impacting growth and inflation. But on the other side of the coin, we've got the transition risk as we move away from our current emissions pathway. What's important here to remember, I think, is that this need to transition is economy-wide. It affects the users as well as the producers of fossil fuels. It's transport, it's agriculture, it's real estate, it's industry. And that transition could lead to a reassessment of the value of every real and every financial asset. Buildings might become unlettable or unsellable. Auto producers might not have plans for electric vehicles, thereby giving rise to credit risk for lenders or market risk for investors. And of course, as we reallocate capital and labour across the economy, we might see economic costs, and including in inflation. I think you mentioned it earlier. We've all been reminded recently about how imbalances in the supply and demand for energy matter for our core objective of price stability. We've all known for ages that the oil price matters for the economic and financial outlook. Maybe too, as we look ahead, so will the future price of carbon and other policies that determine the price of energy. We've been really clear to take our lead from others here. Steve talked about the climate scientists before. We're not climate scientists. We don't look to have an independent opinion on the physical changes to the climate that might occur. Rather, we take our lead from the experts. We do read the IPCC reports through the work in the NGFS that I chair. We work with the scientists that write those IPCC reports. We talk to our own meteorological office in the UK. And just like we don't proclaim to be experts on COVID, we take the views of the experts into account as we formulate our analysis. Similarly, transition risks are going to be determined in practice by government policy. Some of those will be specific, the introduction of electric vehicles. Some will be more general and net zero emissions by 2050. And that will happen alongside technological developments and changes in consumer preference too. And as with fiscal policy, we'll take government policy as an input to our work. But I do want to emphasize that the UK has legislated to deliver net zero by 2050, even if the climate policy to deliver that isn't comprehensively articulated yet. And that means we may see winners and losers, and we need to take that into account as we look ahead and incorporate all of that into our analysis. Now, these economic trends and the financial risks are occurring now, but they're going to be bigger in future. And so they're growing in importance as we go about our work. And we have a particular focus on them when thinking about financial risks, as these risks have got distinctive characteristics which will require a different approach if they're to be managed well. And that's for three reasons. First, these risks are far-reaching in their breadth and scope. They're going to affect every consumer, every corporate, all sectors, all geographies. Impacts likely to be correlated, non-linear, potentially irreversible, tipping points, as Steve mentioned. And so they may be more significant than the other risks that we're used to managing. Second, these risks are simultaneously uncertain and yet totally foreseeable. So I can't tell you now exactly what combination of physical and transition risks we are going to see, but I can say with absolute certainty that either we carry on our current emissions pathway and see physical risks, or we change the pathway and we see transition risks. And that, I hope, underlines that it's not a question of whether we face risk, it's simply a question of risks. And we can't let uncertainty about what will happen lead us to ignore the risks. And then third, for me, this is really important, the size and the balance of those future long-term risks are going to be determined by the actions that we take in the short term, in the next decade, probably the next 5 years. Carbon released today hangs around in the atmosphere for years. And with a fixed carbon budget, the longer that meaningful adjustment is delayed, the sharper and more disruptive a transition we will see. So on both those counts, the climate physics tells us that the near-term actions determine the long-term outcomes. That was the tragedy of the horizon, as Koonin put it. Now, we all know that change needs to happen in the real economy. It's consumers, it's governments, it's corporates. But if that real economy change doesn't happen, and instead we either get increasing climate instability or the risk of a disorderly transition, the financial sector is going to bear that risk. The financial system can't diversify its way out of the risk. The pandemic reminded us that the financial system isn't immune from system-wide risks that arise in the real economy. And of course, while individual investors can divest, the financial system as a whole cannot. All of which means that when you're in my seat at the central bank, we need action to reduce those long-term risks happening soon, or we need to build greater resiliency to be ready for them. Now, the obvious question, and this goes to what Steve was talking about, is how big are these financial risks? And I'm very sorry to say that that's much easier asked than answered. These risks are unprecedented, so we need to look forwards, not backwards, as we try and size them. And as I said earlier, we know that the future path of climate risk itself is subject to huge uncertainty. In our world, we're using scenario analysis as the toolkit to do that, but it's not even straightforward to design those scenarios. The transmission channels from climate risk to economic and financial risks are numerous. There's significant interdependencies. We need to augment our macroeconomic top-down models with granular bottom-up risk assessment, because risk depends on whether firms have got transition plans or not, where individual plants are cited. And of course, none of us have ever done this before. No one has a how to do it manual. Picking up on some of the things that Steve said, the data and the methodologies to do this are incomplete and inadequate. The need for research here is enormous, and we set out a long list of interesting questions that we want everybody's help in answering. All of which means that sizing these future risks, which we need to do if we begin to manage or start building resilience for them, is complex and it's complicated, and few have got the resources to do it well. Now, our view is that we can't have firms and us as guardians of the system assuming that the risk isn't there just because it's hard to size. Therefore, we've been working to make sure that financial decisions take the risks from climate change into account. We've set out supervisory expectations that firms should manage these risks and ensure they're resilient to them. That's what you'd expect for any risk that they face. But we emphasize, as I said earlier, that these risks are different, since the risks of tomorrow are determined by actions taken today. The NGFS has sought to provide some reference scenarios to support this risk analysis. The Bank of England is using those to undertake a system-wide climate scenario exercise. We've got 3 objectives in that exercise to try and size these currently opaque risks, to see where financial firms' business models need to change, both what becomes, I don't know, unfinanceable because insurers won't provide insurance on a house that's on a floodplain, or because there's new business that needs to be done to retrofit 30 million homes for net zero. And third, we're going to drive improvements in firms' risk management. And I want to emphasize that in this work, we don't pretend that we know what will happen. We're getting the firms to look at 3 scenarios, not 1. It's an exploratory exercise, but the results are going to help us decide whether actions to support the safety and soundness of firms or the stability of the system might be necessary. To support all of the above, we've championed public provision of data through the TCFD and the Sustainability Standards Board. To your point, Jonathan, this needs to be grounded in scenarios and forward-looking, as well as describing where firms are. And finally, we're looking to build all of this into our macroeconomic analysis in support of price stability. Now, we recognize that different people have different views on this topic, and that's okay, right? That's what makes markets work. But we must not default to assuming there's zero or small risk when we know for sure that risk is coming, and the size of that future risk is going to reflect our near-term actions. Our view is that by highlighting the consequences of climate change through our actions, we could catalyse, amplify and complement government climate policy to deal with its causes. And similarly, while the course of climate policy matters for our mandate, we cannot and we should not substitute for it. Using our tools to price the externality would create new risks and unintended consequences. So our actions are not adding new things to our mission, nor are they doing things that are rightly for others, but it is taking the new into account alongside the old as we go about fulfilling our mandate to deliver monetary and financial stability and safe and sound financial firms. So in a short answer to your question, Jonathan, would be that the consequences of climate change matter for our existing mandate, and it would be remiss of us not to look at the topic. But as we do so, we need to do our job, not government's job. And perhaps picking up on Steve's point, even doing that is very hard.
Sarah, thank you very much. I am going to push back on you a little bit. And let me just think. I mean, I think there's a divergence here between what we would like to do and what we can do, right? So I would like to be able to control the climate so that we don't have to experience hurricanes. I think all of us would like that, but we all know we don't have the technology to do that. So, I mean, in your talk, you said to us, look, you agree we cannot, that these models are so uncertain, we can't measure risk. But if we can't measure risk, how can you then say we want companies to look at the risks they face?
So what you can do is you can set out some future plausible paths for the climate, for the economic risks that will come. Get the firms, as they do with all of the stress testing that they do for us, set out what would that mean for the risks that are on their balance sheet, and then they can decide how to manage them. That might be about working with their corporates, about trying to reduce the corporate's transmission emissions through a transition plan. It may be carrying on, continuing to finance them, but recognizing that that brings with it certain risks, because we're in this state of the world not that state of the world. And that's what we're exploring through the 3 scenarios that we've got firms working on at the moment. We're not rushing to use our tools, we're exploring what the risks are to size whether these are serious solvency issues or not, and then thinking about how should the financial system best manage those risks. Does it work with its clients to push the transition to net zero, or does it hold capital for what that absence of a transition would mean for the consequences for the financial risks that they face? Because I think you come back to, Jonathan, the fact that there will be risk arising. We see either physical risk or transition risk. I can't tell you which, but I can tell you we will see one of those. And what we're trying to do through our work is get firms to see under these different scenarios, where do those risks materialize? Where are they already resilient? And where might more action be needed?
And we're definitely coming back to this in the general discussion, Sarah. Okay, so our last panelist is Christina Skinner, who is a professor of legal studies and business ethics at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. I will say that, like many things in life, what you think is going to be easy turns out to be very hard. So in putting this panel together, I had a very strong sense that I wanted some legal scholar to talk about what the legal responsibilities and constraints are on government organizations. I was motivated by the fact that we're lucky at Stanford. We have a law school here, which we are, talk to and interact with. And there've been occasions when we've had seminars by law school professors who have pointed out that an assumption that financial economists have been making is just flat out wrong. It turns out that the law will say one thing, but the practice will be very different. And so with that in mind, I wanted to bring a legal scholar to the table to just talk about what are the legal bases for the government organizations that are currently regulating finance and social responsibility. And what I was very surprised to find is that, in fact, this is not a very well-studied area in the legal literature. I'd fully expected to find a lot of legal scholarship on the issue. Like, for the questions I was interested in is, do central banks have the authority to intervene socially? And what are the bounds of this authority? I mean, a legal authority now. And whether the SEC has the legal authority to tell boards how they're constituted and that kind of thing. So luckily there are a few legal scholars, and one of them is Christina, who has a very interesting forthcoming article in the Duke Legal Review entitled Central Bank Activism. So luckily she agreed to join us. So Christina, here were the questions I posed to you. What do current laws allow central banks and other bodies governing financial markets to mandate? What policies are likely to face court challenges, and which ones are clearly within the mandate of the governing bodies? Basically, how much power do these bodies have to affect social change?
Well, thanks for inviting me to be here. I'm glad that you indeed did find me and that I can round out this panel. Like I was saying, I'm especially happy to go last, because I do think it's absolutely essential to recognize that law and constitutional structure are the gating issues to all of this, right? So maybe Friedman suggested that government should set the rules of the game, and I agree with him on most things, but there are plenty of reasons to be troubled about that too, right? So law isn't an afterthought necessarily. We are a society that's bound by the rule of law. So the first question we should be asking is, what is legitimately within the scope of government when it comes to addressing climate change? And at this point, there are quite a broad smattering of financial regulatory initiatives on the table. And so I'm probably going to have to speak much more quickly than I would otherwise to give you the full lay of the land. And in some ways, disclosure initiatives by the SEC is just the tip of the iceberg that has then been preceded by significant initiative in the executive branch and the Treasury Department, and then of course among central banks. And I'll focus on the Fed's unique legal authority and what is within the control of the Fed in particular when it comes specifically to climate change. So like I said, one bucket of regulatory initiatives has very much focused on mandatory disclosure among firms. And the SEC has been on this path for some time, but without necessarily a clear legal authority, they have had to innovate a bit. So the default, the status quo under existing securities law is that any material risk to a business of a public company has to be disclosed in annual periodic reports or in a Form 8K. Well, as it turns out, there wasn't much being disclosed about climate risk. As we've been discussing, it's very difficult to appraise and assess climate risk. So the SEC has decided to force the issue in certain ways. And there are two notable movements. So first, the SEC has been pushing through Dear CEO letters for firms to disclose more and more about their ESG risks and more about their ESG initiatives. Second, as an enforcement matter, the SEC has also recently decided to hold firms' feet to the fire in terms of so-called greenwashing. So firm A, you claim that you're going to reach net zero by some certain point in time. Well, let's see. Give us the concrete proof that you're actually doing that. And if you can't, then now we're going to pursue this as a material misstatement of fact in violation of the securities law. Now, we've seen all of this play out before with the SEC and securities law and their creative use of disclosure to accomplish a substantive outcome in the so-called conflict minerals rule. So that rule was also a disclosure rule, which required firms to disclose whether there were any conflict minerals in their supply chain. Now, it was legally controversial because it was seen as an effort, again, to use disclosure law, which is just supposed to correct information asymmetries in the marketplace, right, to de facto enact some kind of substantive prohibition on a business activity. So just a naked attempt really to use moral suasion and public shaming to get companies to engage or not engage in some kind of business practice. Now, you may well think greenhouse gases are bad and that conflicts minerals in your supply chain are bad too, but this mode of regulating is problematic from a rule of law standpoint. It's regulation through the back door. The SEC hasn't passed any regulation telling firms you must disclose X, Y, or Z specific risk. It's just issuing these vague pieces of guidance. There's their Dear CEO letters. And this is really frowned upon from a constitutional due process and fundamental fairness standpoint. Now, why is that? Well, ordinarily, we expect that regulation is going to go through what's called a notice and comment rulemaking process that is subject to the rigors and the standards of the Administrative Procedure Act. And that piece of legislation essentially says that any given item of regulation can't be arbitrary, it can't be capricious, which means that it needs to be backed by firm evidence or the federal courts will strike it down. But when agencies do things like use guidance, these Dear CEO letters, or use disclosure to masquerade as substantive or positive regulation, they're short-circuiting that process and its procedural guardrails. And an even bigger picture than that, we might look at this kind of regulatory pressure as an effort to accomplish bans on certain kinds of business or financial activity that our democratically elected representatives in Congress haven't agreed to. And I'll come back to this point again, if I have time, when I'm talking about central bank activity. Now, second, the president has also pushed boundaries with his executive authority and used the Treasury in particular to push forward a climate regulatory agenda. And he's done so using a variety of executive orders. Now, obviously, this isn't legislation, this isn't regulation, it's executive edict. So January of last year, the president put all agencies on notice that he intends to pursue an all-of-government approach to climate change. So this means he's expecting the entirety of the administrative state to respond in one way or another to climate change. And in particular, as it regards the financial system and financial regulators, the president directed the Treasury Secretary, who helms the Financial Stability Oversight Council, this interagency council of financial regulators, to engage all of its members to figure out how each agency is tackling climate change. Now, this complement of executive orders is a bit legally questionable for a number of reasons, but particularly because each of these agencies has their own norms of independence vis-a-vis the president and their own differing legal authorities to do anything about climate change. Which brings me to focus in particular on the Fed, which agency, as a central bank, also a creature of Congress, has this very special, extra strong kind of independence vis-a-vis the executive. Now, as Sarah was just explaining, central banks around the world have been thinking about climate change, being asked to address climate change by their constituents. And a number have really leaned in, the ECB, the Bank of England. There have been general calls to increase capital requirements vis-a-vis certain kinds of brown assets. Now, the Fed had for quite some time been much more measured than the other central banks around the world. But in the face of tremendous international, presidential, and public pressure, started to dip its toes a bit more in the water. So it did finally join the NGFS, although it had not yet, it had abstained for a number of years. And it also issued a financial stability report saying it was starting to think about how climate change might interact with its financial stability responsibilities. It's now also stood up 2 separate supervisory committees on climate change. Now, however, it's really important to recognize that relative to the Bank of England or the ECB, the Fed actually has very limited legal authority to act in this space. So the Fed right now is navigating very real limitations in its mandate, which I'll come on to in a moment, and the significant pressure from the executive, the public, the press, and the international community. So I'll briefly walk you through where the Fed does, in fact, have legal authority to act and where it doesn't, how this compares to other central banks, and what the bigger picture concerns are for our constitutional structure and the rule of law. So first, think about the Fed's monetary policy powers. We often think about monetary policy when we think about central banks. Well, the Fed has all the authority that it needs to react to climate-related shocks. It has the traditional lender of last resort powers, lending through the discount window or standing up emergency liquidity facilities. These powers are completely agnostic as to the cause of any given macroeconomic shock. However, when it comes to more proactive or offensive kinds of measures like green QE, as it's sort of colloquially called, that's totally off limits for the Federal Reserve, although many in the public continue to press the Fed and other central banks to do things like that. There are real limitations in the Federal Reserve Act about what kinds of assets the Fed can buy in the open market. Section 14 of the Federal Reserve Act essentially sets out a list of things that the Fed can buy when it's engaging in open market purchases. And private bonds are not one of those things, whether they're green, brown, purple, or otherwise. Second, if you look specifically at the monetary policy mandate of the Fed, it's instructed to pursue maximum employment and price stability. And it is, in fact, a stretch to tie price stability right now to climate change. And the Fed has never exercised its monetary policy in an anticipatory way, chasing things that could hypothetically be on the horizon. Now, it's interesting to compare what you have in the Treaty for the Functioning of the European Union and think about the European Central Bank. So the ECB actually has, as part of its mandate, a requirement that the ECB take in view the environmental goals of the Union in fashioning its monetary policy. Now, this is totally different from the Fed. Here, you see a clear legal authority to pursue a policy goal. The Bank of England is similarly situated. So the Monetary Policy Committee has what's referred to as a secondary mandate to have regard to the economic policy of the government. This gives HMT the power to specify certain goals for the MPC. And in 2021, they did just that. In their annual remit letter to the MPC, they told the MPC to have regard to sustainability. Now, the US Congress could have given the Fed the power to make this kind of policy, or for the Treasury to tell the Fed to make this kind of policy, but it hasn't. So if the Fed were to do an offensive greening of the financial system, or to take various sustainability considerations in view in reshaping price stability maneuvers, well, it would look and feel a lot like the Fed is making policy without congressional authorization. Now, there are other things the Fed could do to try and move dollars away from brown businesses, for example, but here too, there's also very weak legal authority. So regulation, for example, right? That's the big one. But the basis for hiking capital requirements, the authority the Fed had to implement the Basel III regime, well, that's Section 165 of the Dodd-Frank Act, and that is the financial stability provision of the Dodd-Frank Act. So the premise would have to be that there's a financial stability risk inherent in climate change. But at least in the case of US banks, it's very difficult, if you look carefully at banks' balance sheet, to demonstrate a financial stability risk tied to climate change, at least if we're using the term financial stability risk the same way that we have been for the past 10 years. Now, a risk to financial stability, as we've understood it all these years, comes from some kind of credit risk that is lurking on big banks' balance sheet that, if and when it materializes, it so damages those banks' balance sheets that their solvency comes into question. That's, of course, what happened in the 2008 crisis in connection with residential mortgage products. But in order for that kind of Minsky type moment to happen, to result from climate change, a number of bad things would have to happen first that presently make the risk so attenuated that it seems to fall outside of what we would think of as an actionable financial stability risk. So for one, the actual loans on bank balance sheets would have to become impaired because of climate change. Now, under the Fed's own regulation, the word impaired has a very specific meaning. It means that the borrower cannot repay the loan in whole or in part. So that means some physical event like a storm or a storm series, or policy changes forcing a transition away from certain carbon intensive business models would have to make these borrowers unable to repay their loans in whole or in part. Now, could that happen? Well, yes, but it does seem a bit unlikely given the way that these big banks go about underwriting, right? Banks in the US typically lend to corporates at 50% LTV or less. So this means that some event, physical or transition related, would have to wipe out 50% or more of the borrower's value so that they couldn't repay their loans. Could that happen in a way that hurts banks? Yes, but that also seems very unlikely given the way that banks structure their balance sheet and their business models. Regarding physical risk, because these banks are so geographically diversified, the physical manifestation of any climate risk would have to simultaneously transpire across multiple US and global regions all at once. Regarding transition risk, well, if it's legal and policy changes that we fear that are going to put various bank borrowers out of business, well, that kind of policy regulatory change would have to be so sudden and so severe that none of these carbon-facing businesses could plan or adapt. And a sudden transition also seems not only an oxymoron, but also quite unlikely. But ultimately, the key point is that these banks' exposure to the carbon exposed industry, to these big carbon emitters, is so small that even if every single one of the loans were wiped out, their equity cushion would be 2 or 3 times the volume to absorb all of those losses. So I looked at the balance sheets of all of the US SIFIs and their exposure to the big carbon emitters, the loans that would be most likely to be first hit by any kind of transition risk, are 5% total wholesale loan exposure or less. And like I said, their equity is 2 or 3 times that on an absolute value. So granted, the Financial Stability Oversight Council has pushed, right, the Fed to characterize climate change as a financial stability risk, but it's really put the Fed in a difficult position given this factual analysis. So then we come on to supervision. So central banks, the Fed specifically, does have actually quite capacious authority in this firm level microprudential supervisory arena. And that's probably why you see it focused there first and foremost. It has very capacious language in something called the Bank Holding Company Act that it generally is supposed to supervise firms for safety and soundness, right? So that means that the Fed can legitimately, with lawful authority, go in and converse with banks about their underwriting practice, the quality of their assets vis-a-vis climate as a credit risk, and so on and so forth. But when we start thinking about the macroprudential side of things, things get a lot more gray, right? You would have a lot of trouble justifying a stress testing under the current stress test because those stress tests are really about the capital planning process. So you could come up with a climate scenario that has to do, you could come up with a scenario that has to do with climate, but it's not clear that would change much for banks given the exposure that I just outlaid. Now, to do something like scenario analysis, which certain Fed governors favor and which the Bank of England has done, again, it's not clear that the Fed has the legal authority to do this. There are really important statutory differences between the Fed and the Bank of England. The Bank of England Act gives the bank an explicit financial stability objective, and it also gives the Financial Policy Committee that secondary mandate to have regard to the government's, and in this case, the government's green goals. But the Federal Reserve Act doesn't give the Fed an explicit financial stability mandate at all. Neither does the Dodd-Frank Act. And again, there is no secondary mandate that requires the Fed to have regard to the goals of the government. So this just means that to come up with a new significant regulatory burden on firms, you would probably need some kind of congressional authorization. So ultimately, and I'll wrap up here because I see that I'm out of time, we need to ask, what is the Fed's goal? Right? If it's to react to economic emergencies, some kind of macroeconomic malaise, to monitor asset quality on a micro level, well, the Fed has that authority. But if we really wanted to envision a central bank that went more of a European or a UK route to try and actually make the system greener, Congress would need to legislate. Otherwise, we're really changing the role of the central bank, which would create a number of institutional problems on the Fed and blur the line between the monetary and the fiscal authority in a way that is, again, constitutionally problematic.
Christina, that was excellent. I think I certainly learned a lot about the legal underpinnings of what the Fed can and cannot do. And also, I don't think I fully appreciate the difference between the US central bank and the European central banks in terms of the underlying legal authority. Okay, so we are over. Let me open up.
Jonathan,
yes?
can I just respond, please, to something that Christina said that I think is really important to get clear, at least as far as the Bank of England is concerned. I think, Christina, you said that our aim was to make the UK financial system greener. Our aim is to ensure that the system is resilient to the risks from climate change. That is a different thing, and it's really important because you can be resilient in two ways. You can transition to net zero, or you can have capital resources that are consistent with the risks, and the climate exploratory exercise that we're doing at the moment will give us the opportunity to size those risks. Right now, we don't have good visibility on them. So I do think it's really important not to overstate the difference between what we're doing and what the Fed could do, because it's with an eye to identifying those possible future risks to safety and soundness, which is in essence, I think, the same as the Fed's job.
Okay.
Yeah, no, do you want me to respond? Yeah, no, I would just say quickly, I think the conversation has evolved a lot between what central banks can do and what the public perceives as legitimate. And I also think that, taking your comment in view, there is a difference between the financial stability arm of things, which you've been heading up, and certain measures that could be taken on the monetary policy side of things. But I would also reiterate that I do think the Bank of England has a much stronger legal authority to work in pursuit of the government's goals than does the US Central Bank.
I'm sure that's true. We get sent a letter every year.
Okay, so what I would like to do is open it up to the audience. So raise your hands and I will just pick you just as if we were sitting in a room. I won't know exactly what questions you're asking, because I think that's the advantage of an open and interesting discussion. I don't want to be the person choosing who to call. So I don't see any hands right now. Let me give it a few seconds. I'm a bit surprised that I haven't got, that there's been nobody who's
Jonathan, you've got a couple of questions in the question queue.
In the question and answer thing. Okay, so why don't I, Florence, since you have a question, why don't you go ahead?
It has to do with, okay, we all know there's no such thing as 0% risk or 100% risk. And this question is to our second speaker. Given if the increased CO2 production will cause significant economical and damage and non-economic personal damage to people, and the mitigation factors to decrease it hopefully are getting less and less, why would we not play it safer? I am not a scientist on this. I don't know all the costs of mitigation, but I do know I love my electric car. I think it's great we're going to it. So that's the question to the second speaker. And if any other ones have comments, just because, we don't know, and that's a risk.
Yeah, so far be it from me to, as a physicist, talk about the philosophy of risk, but I'm going to try. Look, everything in life is a trade-off. And yes, other things being equal, we would reduce emissions. Similarly, to refer to the current pandemic, other things being equal, to keep everybody safe, we'd all lock down for a long time. But we need to keep the economy going, we need to keep the kids in school, etc. So there's a trade-off. And this administration has gradually realized that there is a trade-off in the COVID situation. Similarly, there is a trade-off in the emissions. Emissions reductions do not come at zero cost. But maybe even more importantly, you know, where do you live, Florence? I Googled your name and it looks like you live in Atlanta. Is that correct?
Yes,
yeah.
it's getting hotter. Well,
Yeah, right. Okay. So
I mean, this year.
You know, you mentioned your electric car. Depending upon how your electricity is produced, and I've not looked it up for Atlanta, the emissions may actually be greater than a gasoline-powered car. That's true in Ohio, for example, I know. So we have to worry about the whole system. But more importantly, you know, all right, I'm going to take a second and tell a perhaps politically incorrect joke these days. The Lone Ranger, since this is the American Finance Association, I can use a cultural reference. The Lone Ranger and his sidekick Tonto are in a jam because they're trapped by a bunch of Indians, Native Americans. And Tonto, of course, is an Indian. And the Lone Ranger turns to Tonto and says, "We're in a jam." And Tonto says, "What do you mean we?" And when we say we need to reduce emissions, I would say the same thing. What do you mean we? The Indians, the Chinese, the Russians, the other big emitters have a very different objective function and very different risk calculus. They're facing the wolf at the door in terms of adequate energy, whereas we're worried about our cholesterol, which is a longer term thing. So I think the risk calculus is not so obvious, and it is a global problem.
So I'll just weigh in briefly on risk from a finance perspective. So I support a soccer team in the UK, which often loses major playoff finals. So what happens when they get into playoff final is I bet on the other team, so there's certainly some financial payoff when my team inevitably loses. And so why is that relevant? Like, we always think about climate change risk, and we think that because of that, we need to buy these green assets. But there's actually an argument that you might want to buy some brown assets. Why? Because if you fail to transition to a low carbon economy, then those brown assets will be a hedge against that failure. So there's a nice paper by Burton Hollyfield, Steve Baker, and Emilio Ospamella, which makes that point. So actually, even if we think that these risks are neither 0 nor 100%, it's not immediately obvious that, okay, if there's climate change risk, we want to actually avoid these brown assets. They might actually be good hedges.
I mean, one of the things that has struck me is the difference between what we would like to do and what we can do. I mean, so it's true that there are risks, but there are tons of risks in the economy. Let's assume that we even agree that there's climate risk, but if we can't measure it, I'm not sure what we can do about it. Let's agree there's climate risk. Let's agree the climate is warming. But if we can't measure this and we can't, how exactly do we address it? It's not clear to me.
Jonathan, I'm happy to have a go at that, at least how I think about it. I think what we can do using scenario analysis that looks to explore different physical and different transition risk characteristics is get to see qualitatively where do these risks arise. And it is not as simple as this is a story about fossil fuel producers. It is an economy-wide transition. We all use energy. My house here in the UK could be on a floodplain. My house here in the UK may need to, depending on the government's climate policy, have to at some future point meet certain energy standards in order that I can sell it. And what scenario analysis does is enable us to see where those currently rather opaque risks might arise. And that then prompts a conversation about, well, how likely are those risks to arise? What is climate policy going to happen? Are there mitigants that we can put in place? Should the pricing of that risk change? Should we be building additional capital resilience for that risk? And it's nuanced, it's not black and white. It's qualitative rather than quantitative, but it is nonetheless helpful. I firmly believe that just because we can't measure a risk accurately, it would be inappropriate to assume therefore it's zero and we don't need to think about it.
Sarah, I agree entirely with that. That we certainly cannot assume that just because we can't measure it, it isn't there. But I'm asking, my concern is, let's assume it's there, but we can't measure it. What do we do?
So we're getting better at measuring it all the time, right? So I told you, I mentioned in my comments about the NGFS scenarios that we put out there that take the IPCC climate scenarios, working with NIGEM and financial risk and physical risk modeling experts, and put a suite of models together that give us our best guess as to how we can translate climate outcomes into economic and financial risk. All of that is open source. You can all look at that, critique it. You can do research to make it better. In 5 years' time, we'll look back at the first set of scenarios and go, oh my golly, they were terrible, but they will improve through time. And we've just got to roll our sleeves up and do a better job of trying to size these risks, or alternatively, getting ourselves comfortable that we are confident enough that these risks are ones that the system has got the ability to absorb without creating broader consequences on the back of that. I am just not confident where we are now that I can say we don't need to worry about this risk. What I see is a risk, to the point about precautionary principles and insurance, that will arise in the future, reflecting the decisions that are taken today, about which I don't have good visibility and good precision about what those future risks might be, and so therefore would quite like to get better visibility of them and think about different ways of managing them, starting now, because the decisions that we take now are going to have long-term implications because of the cold hard climate physics.
I think this conversation really highlights that there's such a spectrum of possible interventions, right? And on one end of the spectrum, that there are things like Sarah's just discussing, and which I know the Financial Policy Committee does, in terms of research, modeling, trying to understand how to measure the risk, right? Which is sort of the one of the first questions, right? Even as
stage one,
right? Which even when I was going my presentation, it's like based on the facts that we know, right? And there is a lot that we don't know. I think what becomes increasingly concerning from a legal standpoint, at least, is the fact that at least the Fed faces a lot of pressure to react, right, before certain kinds of facts are ascertained, right? So to do things like increasing capital requirements vis-a-vis certain kinds of assets. Well, we don't know which kinds of assets would be likely, if any, to pose a particular kind of risk, or what the knock-on effects of that would be, right? Same goes for any kind of, monetary policy action that tries to, at least in the Fed's standpoint, direct capital to some industries and not others, because not only are you possibly distorting markets, right, but you're also posing these really difficult monetary fiscal questions about allocating credit in a way that monetary authorities traditionally haven't had. So I think there's a very big difference, right, between sort of trying to understand the issue and having, engaging sort of that intellectual rigor of a central bank, right? And in the US, we have the Federal Reserve banks that undertake a tremendous amount of research, and a lot of them are engaged in this question, right? And then starting to go toward the sort of more coercive kinds of regulation and potentially even supervision. Of course, it's important that the research be balanced. That's a totally separate issue, but yeah, so that's all I would add there.
And Jonathan, just to emphasize, one of the things that I hope I said clearly, I certainly intended to say clearly, was that we don't think that our tools like capital should be there and used to deal with the causes of climate change, to drive greenhouse gas emissions down. That is rightly the preserve of elected governments. We can't use capital as a way of trying to get an implicit carbon price out there. That is for governments to do. There will be unintended consequences, and it is not the right thing to do for.
So could I ask, and I'm completely ignorant about the financial system, but I read in the news about many people defunding fossil fuel plants, both in the developed world, but more importantly, in the developing world. That's not the central banks. Is that correct?
No. And if anything, Steve, it goes to the point that I again tried to emphasize. The financial system can't divest its way out of this problem. The only way this problem is reduced is if emissions are reduced. So divestment is a paper exercise. It is not a risk reducing exercise. There is no pressure whatsoever from the central banks, or certainly the Bank of England, to do things like that, because it doesn't speak to reducing the risk. There is, however, an engagement piece, so that the financial institutions engage with their customers on whether or not they have plans to decarbonize, and if not, and there's considered to be greater risk there, they hold greater financial resources to deal with it. But I think paper decarbonization is a real risk. It's something that appears to make sense on paper, but actually makes our collective future problems worse.
I wish our university endowments in the US understood that.
Yeah, this is a really important point, which is really misunderstood. I actually bring in some finance work that some people here have done on divestment and engagement. Right? Often we think, well, what we want to do is defund these companies by dumping their stock. If you sell stock, you can only sell if somebody else buys, and who holds that stock? It's going to be some companies that actually just don't care as much about it. So why was it that engine number one was able to get the directors elected to Exxon? They had a seat at the table. So there's work that Jonathan's done with Jules van Binsbergen. There's work that Oliver Hart, Luigi Zingales have done, which looks at actually divestment being really quite impotent in terms of changing the cost of capital. Number one, there's a lot of other investors who are willing to buy if you sell. And number two, does the cost of capital really mean much to those companies? They're not really raising much capital to begin with. So there are a lot of investors who come and say, look, buy our mutual fund, we have a net zero portfolio. Well, in fact, what you want to have is a portfolio which does hold some troubled companies and is engaging with them. Like if you are to say, I'm a great doctor, all my patients are really healthy. No, if you're a doctor, you want to be dealing with some sick patients. And I think this is something which is really misunderstood and one of the biggest areas of greenwashing that investors are engaging in.
Couldn't agree more, Alex.
I'm reminded of the Hippocratic Oath here, which is, first do no harm. If we are very uncertain about the effect of climate change, why is it obvious that we should act? I mean, that's one of the assumptions that I came to realize. People just assume it is obvious that we should act. And I'm kind of interested in, if we don't know what we're doing, why is it obvious to act?
I think there are some things that we should be acting on. All right. I think Sarah, somebody mentioned RD, research development demonstration. Absolutely, for carbon light or emissions light technologies. Absolutely. I think what you can question is the need for a large scale and rapid decarbonization, particularly when the rest of the world is not going to come along.
Jonathan, what I was going to say is that what we know is the later we leave it, the more we have sown the seeds of future physical risks. And for a fixed carbon budget, the sharper will be the transition. So the returns to investment now are high.
There isn't really a sharp cutoff. As I relate in the book, I once asked this guy, Schellenhuber, who is the father of the 2-degree limit, why'd you pick 2 degrees? Why not 2.5 or 1.5? And he said, it's an easy number for politicians to remember. Okay, so the world is not going to fall apart at 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees.
I think Jonathan's question is a really important one. We all know about economics, about costs and benefits. There's trade-offs, right? There is an optimal amount. And the idea that we should just focus entirely on decarbonisation, not realising that there are human costs to this, This is like my opening comment, that if we were just to leave it to investors, the 1%, the elites, we're not going to be taking into account the loss of jobs in the Rust Belt. So there was uncertainty. With uncertainty, it's still prudent to take action. But it seems to be that within the investor industry, climate is the one issue which is trumping all other issues, trumping all other environmental issues. There's things such as plastic packaging or sustainability of soils and things like that, and trumping the social consequences. And I think it is one of many issues. It is an important issue, but it shouldn't necessarily be the one issue where all investors will say, look, I've got a zero carbon portfolio, quite apart from my earlier point that actually it's not clear that divestment is the most effective way to address this.
So Florence, I'm not sure if your hand was up before or you have another question.
Oh, I have a million questions, so I want others to do it. All right, I'm a physician, so we have to go through trade-offs and risk and benefits with our patients all the time. And this is just a much bigger issue on trade-offs. My question though, if I have a patient who has like a 2% chance that if we do this, we're gonna kill them, versus that if we don't do it, they're going to feel a little bit better, then most of my patients would decide it's not worth that little bit to feel better because I've got this chance of being killed. If, as technology advances, that the cost of mitigating CO2 production, which, the windmills are getting much more efficient, how can you help the developing world with this kind of thing? Increase, there's a lot of economic benefit from doing this new energy production. It just seems like it's not worth the cost if many of these climate scientists are right. They may be wrong, but the cost to our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, I'm not willing to risk it. I'm not going to kill myself to do it. But I agree with the third presenter that let's go for it. It's just, at least in the US, and we can help others, the trade-offs are worth it. That's anybody else. I'd love for other people in the audience to hear your thoughts, but I love the panelists, but I don't want to talk again.
I think you raise a really important point. Like there are really serious consequences, but I would also say that the human consequences of if you make people unemployed and so on, that can be quite significant as well, and that will affect their families and so forth. So certainly, if indeed the climate outcomes end up being as concerning as many people say, that's a really bad scenario. But there's also a lot of human costs also, and where there's uncertainty, like there's many things that we do which we will voluntarily take risks of life. Like some people here and also in the attendees, they ski a lot, right? That's dangerous. We engage in some dangerous activities. And if our goal was to maximize the probability of life, then we wouldn't engage in that. But because there are some alternative parts of our objective function, we will make those trade-offs. And you might think, oh, that's a bit silly. If skiing makes us feel a little bit better, it's a dangerous activity, but we're still willing to make that trade-off, even though you might think the benefit is small compared to the potential cost.
I find this a very OECD-centric discussion, OECD-centric discussion. We're 1.5 billion people in the developed world. There are 6.5 billion people whose energy needs will grow as they develop. And the question I would pose to those of you on the panel and the audience, if you were in charge of China or India, and you really cared about this issue, but had all of the other constraints and pressures that a big developing country has, what would you do?
If I might come in on that, Steve, one of the things that we are trying to do through the work that we're doing through the NGFS, through our scenario analysis, is try and be clear what the economic costs are, what the issues are for development, to think about the distributional consequences within countries, the distributional consequences across countries, to try and make sure, to Alex's point, that it isn't the analytics or the top 1% who can afford a Tesla who are driving the decisions here, but we're thinking about these issues in the round. There are risks on both sides here. We can be too slow to decarbonize, we can be too fast. Goldilocks like, I think what we have to try and do is find the right way forward. That goes to really investing in the analytics here, getting the data, trying to understand the macroeconomic and financial consequences, and trying to steward the economy on that ideal path. It's not straightforward. It's primarily for governments, but if we're not careful, there is a real risk that consumers and the financial system could determine the pace of the transition, and that could come with some negative consequences for long-term support for dealing with the problem, in my opinion.
Let me move the discussion a little bit away from where we're going, because I think would be particularly interesting to the audience. Okay, so there's a definite move afoot to require companies to specifically divulge their climate risk. And the question I have for this panel is, do we have enough technology to actually accomplish that? In other words, are the climate models, do the carbon models measure up to that requirement, that a company could divulge anything meaningful in terms of climate risk?
I would say not. Companies are not regions. They're at discrete locations. Their business model might be affected by regulation, absolutely. But companies also adapt. And if it gets a little warmer and you're an agricultural producer, then you move further north, or you change the genetic strain you're cultivating, and so on. So I think it's really difficult to do that.
Jonathan, if I might come in, our scenarios, and I know I keep going on about these, but our scenarios are designed to enable companies, financial institutions, to think about their business in different general equilibrium, coherent future states of the world. So we've got paths for carbon prices in there that people can think, well, if that is the path for an implied carbon price, what does that mean for the profitability of my business? And to Steve's point, what changes would I make to my business in that event? And I think we have to move from the static to the strategic. It isn't about where companies are today, it's where they are going to be, and how their strategy is as resilient as it possibly can be to different possible future states of the world.
Let me ask the following question, which is, if you she's I just lost my train of thought there. Okay, why don't I shut up and then I'll go back to my train of thought.
Jonathan, maybe if I might add just one final thought. TCFD has been the go-to standard for disclosure for this, and the Bank of England has done a TCFD disclosure, 60 pages worth, covering what we do as a corporate and how we manage our balance sheets, looking ahead and describing what we're going to do as well as what we currently do. So I've had a go. It is possible to do it, a bit like I was saying before about the models. We'll get better through time, but I don't think because we can't do perfection today, we shouldn't do anything.
I know what I was going to ask. So Christina, one of the questions I have is the legal authority to require companies to disclose any specific particular risk. I mean, where does that legal authority come from, and how would that play out?
Right. So, I mean, I guess it depends if you're talking about mandatory disclosures from the SEC right, versus some kind of supervisory requirement from the Fed or the other bank regulators, right, the OCC or the FDIC. I mean, where the securities law are concerned, as I was saying, it's always been the case that companies are supposed to disclose material risk to their business. Now, there's always been litigation and, debate, academic scholarship, what does material mean, right? And so companies have the securities law specifies, 5 or 6 different things that would be material, but then it has sort of a catch-all phrase. And this doesn't capture sort of operational kinds of risks, right? So this question of, well, what kind of cyber risk would be material, right? What sort of cyber breach rises to the level of material? Is it these little incursions every day? Is that something you disclose? Is it just a big cyber breach? Where's the line, right? That was all left to interpretation, right? And now the similar sorts of questions are being asked about climate, but it's a bit more difficult to ascertain because companies aren't presently suffering from adverse effects from climate change. It's much more in the realm of the hypothetical, which is why you haven't seen companies really saying much about climate change, because it's a sort of lose-lose proposition for them, right? The SEC is upset that they're not saying more about their climate risk, but at the same time, if they say too much or too little or to the wrong thing, they open themselves up to civil litigation from shareholders or from the SEC's enforcement capacity for material misstatements. So there is legal authority around language in the Securities Exchange Act about, material risk to the business, but it's all about who defines materiality. Right now, the SEC could try and define that in regard to climate change, but if it was going to do it properly, it would have to do it through this rulemaking process that proceeds pursuant to the Administrative Procedure Act. And that's going to be difficult for it because there's going to have to be enough criteria that is firm and tried and true and evidence-backed and objective that it could withstand a legal challenge in court. That's probably going to be really hard. That's why you see agencies doing things like using supervisory guidance. And that's why it's controversial, right? It's controversial when you try and accomplish regulation through supervisory guidance because it hasn't gone through all the rigors. So that's the securities side of things. With regard to the central bank, there's, the central bank wears lots of different hats. So when you're just talking about its supervisory function in particular, supervisors have a lot of latitude to engage firms on an individual basis to ask them more informally, what risks are there to your business? How is your governance keeping a pace with the various kinds of risks that face your business? That's one way, that supervisors can engage firms, and there is technically legal authority to do that because the language around safety and soundness is really broad. Now, the former vice chair for supervision, Randy Quarles, he for many years tried to sort of push past the relative opacity that microprudential supervisors have been, acting under and say, well, if we're going to hold firms' feet to the fire, if we're going to issue sort of informal or formal supervisory actions for certain kinds of risk lapses, then we need to be more transparent, more firm in our criteria about what that is. So, we don't have a new vice chair for supervision announced yet. It's not clear if that sort of, emphasis on greater transparency and objectivity will continue. But that is sort of the two pieces I would say. You've got like firm level bank supervisors who have a lot of latitude, but not that much transparency. You have the SEC that has a lot of transparency, but less latitude. I don't know if that answers your question.
I think it would be great if there were a court challenge to somebody's assessment of climate risk. That would really start to get the issues on the table.
Well, the challenge with bank supervisors, at least, is that there are very, very few incentives for a bank to sue their supervisor. So that...
Right. But a shareholder could,
let me add just one little thing that kind of might put a positive spin on this at the end of our panel, Jonathan. We put out our supervisory expectations for banks and insurers for comment, for consultation, as we do with everything we do. For the first time ever in the history of financial regulation, the majority of the comments that came back wanted us to do more, to provide more guidance and to help them do it better, because they knew it was a risk that they didn't have their arms around. They wanted to get their arms around. There was pressure from their customers and from their investors to do it. So for the first time ever, firms wanted us to do more.
Okay, well, that's a good note to end. the panel discussion. I certainly learned a lot about stuff that I didn't know about. And I hope the people in the audience did too. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for spending the 2 hours here. And let's see what happens.